Good morning and welcome to the Stylo News Intelligence Update for June 16, 2026. I'm your host, and we're here to deliver your morning intelligence explainer. Today's briefing is titled, China Tests the Boundaries, Taiwan, Taiping Island, and the South China Sea. Over the next few minutes, we'll be bringing you a clear, factual, and measured analysis of the key events that have shaped the East Asian theater over the past 2 weeks. So let's get right to it.
This briefing is brought to you by ProWave AI. They're the developers of the Stylo Intel Ops open source intelligence program and Stylo News, the commercial platform you can find on the web and through mobile applications. Here are the top stories on our radar this morning. First, an East Asia intelligence update, followed by a map of key events. Then, we'll cover the impacts and perspectives of the region's decision makers, dive into some social media intelligence, and wrap things up with a near-term strategic forecast.
Starting with Section 1, our East Asia Intelligence Update on recent maritime escalations. Let's look at the top-line assessment of the past 2 weeks.
The primary intelligence question we're tracking right now is, will China attack Taiwan? We're evaluating this strictly by the data and current reporting parameters, keeping our focus squarely on the facts on the ground.
And the bottom line up front is this: there is no imminent attack indicated. What we're actually seeing is a pattern of continued gray zone coercion and maritime normalization. We are simply not tracking the mass amphibious embarkation or the surge in civilian shipping requisitions that a full-scale invasion would require. On the other side, Taiwan is conducting its own asymmetric deterrence drills. This includes deploying U.S. origin attack drones and running coastal defense live-fire exercises, basically signaling a deterrence posture against a medium-term threat. Our confidence level in this assessment is medium.
Which brings us to our second key intelligence requirement. Will China secure control over the South China Sea?
Our assessment here points to an expanding de facto control in localized contested areas. They're doing this through incremental administrative and maritime pressure. However, achieving full uncontested control of the entire South China Sea in the immediate term is unlikely. That ambition is heavily constrained right now by active Philippine resistance in places like Scarborough Shoal, along with growing security coordination between Japan and the Philippines. When you add in the highly visible presence of Allied naval forces, our confidence level in this assessment sits at medium-high.
Moving on to Section 2, our map of key events. Let's see how this is all geographically building across the theater. Looking at the tactical open-source intelligence map, you'll notice red indicators marking distinct maritime pressure points. These stretch out from the eastern approaches of Taiwan, move south through the Pratas Islands, and concentrate heavily around the Spratlys and Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. It's a remarkably wide-reaching area of operations.
Let's zero in on a specific incident. On June 12th, independent reports showed Chinese Coast Guard vessels entering prohibited waters near Taiping Island, also known as Ituaba. Now, this is a calculated gray zone escalation against a Taiwan-held outpost. It effectively tests Taipei's capacity to enforce control at a remote location, carefully pushing boundaries without crossing the threshold into open combat.
Looking at broader operational escalations, we're seeing the deployment of floating structures and personnel at Scarborough Shoal. That move has actually prompted formal protests from Manila over creeping militarization. Over in the Paracel Islands, there's the ongoing development of maritime outposts on reclaimed land, specifically at Antelope Reef. And notably, Beijing recently disclosed its tracking and use of electronic interference against a Dutch Navy frigate, the HNLMS De Ruyter. This was a clear demonstration of upgraded response capabilities against foreign vessels operating in the area.
In Section 3, we're covering impacts and perspectives. Let's objectively examine the strategic viewpoints and motivations driving the key decision-makers.
It is essential we impartially lay out the opposing strategic frameworks at play here. On one side, the People's Republic of China views its actions as a firm defense of its territorial sovereignty. They explicitly label the recent maritime boundary talks between Japan and the Philippines as illegal, positioning their own patrols as a necessary response to foreign provocation. On the other side, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and the U.S. view their deepening coordination as defending against territorial aggression. Their stated goals are upholding the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and ensuring international freedom of navigation.
So what does this mean for U.S. assets in the region? Our intelligence estimate assesses a moderate and rising risk to U.S. military forces. Given the visible presence of U.S. forces, like the F-35B operations linked to the USS Boxer in the South China Sea, there's an elevated potential for unsafe intercepts, electronic interference, or a miscalculation. As for U.S. embassies and diplomatic outposts, the direct kinetic threat remains low. However, we are tracking elevated risks for cyber intrusions, surveillance, and orchestrated protests.
Section 4 brings us to social media intelligence.
Let's gauge the public sentiment and see what the open source analysis tells us.
When we analyze how the public and experts are reacting on platforms like X, some very clear patterns emerge. On the topic of regional militarization, sentiment is broadly negative and alarmed. It's viewed as a direct threat to stability. But interestingly, when discussing specific sovereignty defense operations, the sentiment tends to be neutral or resigned. Users seem to take a pragmatic view, seeing it as China asserting rights without actually signaling an invasion. As for U.S. strategic posture, the reaction is mixed. While many support defensive alliances, analysts are tracking pockets of anti-U.S. sentiment that approve of China's expanding reach. And finally, open-source predictive markets like Polymarket show the odds of a Taiwan invasion remain remarkably low, holding steady at roughly 7%.
Which brings us to Section 5, our near-term strategic forecast. Based on the data we've reviewed, here is what to look out for in the coming weeks.
The intelligence forecast identifies a deliberate campaign of cumulative pressure. Rather than a decisive war, here are the most likely courses of action. First, expect intensified gray zone coercion and maritime encroachment around Taiwan and disputed features in the South China Sea. Second, look for heightened legal warfare and cyber operations intended to weakening opposing positions. And third, persistent political messaging designed to counter the emerging Japan-Philippines-US coordination. Ultimately, the objective appears to be the normalization of a Chinese presence, setting the stage for a future blockade or quarantine framework.
Section 6, the Stylo News Conclusion. That wraps up the analytical portion of this morning's briefing.
This early morning explainer serves as a brief look at the data. To dive deeper into a complete analysis of these past 2 weeks, we highly encourage you to listen to the full Stylo News Intel Update podcast on your favorite channel, or just follow the link on this post. You can also subscribe and access AI-powered news on demand by visiting www.stylonews.com.
We'll leave you with this final thought to consider throughout your day. As gray zone tactics become the established, new normal in the region, what exact trigger will reshape the Indo-Pacific balance of power next? Thank you for listening and stay informed.